Imagine with me for a moment, if you would, living in a place of utter poverty. Nobody has adequate housing. Nobody has running water or plumbing. There's no electricity, so obviously there's no internet or cell phones or computers. And almost everybody's sick. And there's very little health care available for everybody in your community. This is basically the story of what it was like in 1866 when the first boatload of people with leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, but not at that time, arrived at the Kalaupapa Peninsula on the very northern shore of the island of Molokai. They literally were dumped off by a boat. The first 12 people, 8 men, 4 women, or maybe that was 3 women, let's see if I can count right, 8, 9, 10. Oh, and then there was one little boy. I had never heard this story before. They were on the ship, a schooner called the Warwick, and basically they arrived with the clothes on their back and whatever they could carry. And for years after that, more and more people who had leprosy were dropped off and pretty much left to fend for themselves. I told you when we began today's service that today is Kalaupapa Sunday, and I learned quite a bit since last summer's Aha Pai Aina in terms of what it was really like for the people that were there. The little boy was known as a kokua. Kokua in Hawaiian means help or a helper. He was there to help a family member because in Hawaiian culture, one of the worst possible things that could happen to a person would be to be separated from one's family and isolated from your family for the rest of your life. Many kokua went to Kalaupapa over the years, about a 100-year period where people were just dropped off because the government believed during that time that leprosy was highly contagious. It was contagious, but we know now that it wasn't that contagious. We also know now that most of the people who had leprosy were Hawaiian because Hawaiians had such a low tolerance of resistance to the many, many diseases that people had brought from all over the world, from Asia, Europe, the Americas. The Hawaiian people had no tolerance to almost every disease that was brought, and that included leprosy. However, at the time, what made matters worse is that people said because the Hawaiian people are immoral, mainly meaning sexually immoral, that's why they get leprosy. And so it was a feeling of shame that was placed on many of the Hawaiian people. And they built their homes out of whatever scrap they could find on that peninsula. The government didn't provide housing for them. So these people did the best they could. There were 8,000 people, and then some, over about a 100-year period that were just dropped off to fend for themselves. I was pretty shocked to find out about the kokua, the helpers that went along. I was also surprised that in 1866, the same year that the first 12 people were dropped off, a bunch of people who were Protestant Christians got together and decided that they wanted to have their own church right there on the Kalaupapa Peninsula in a place called Kalawa'o on the eastern shores of the peninsula. And they wrote to all of their churches all over the Hawaiian Islands, from Kauai down to Hawaii Island, and they asked to be removed from the rolls of their churches because they were going to be charter members of a brand new church. And they decided to name it Silawama, which is the Hawaiian name for Siloam. And those of you that know your gospel stories know that Siloam is the name of the healing pool where in the story of Jesus and a particular healing, people went there because it was a place of healing. And Siloam also means sent. And the people of Kalapana decided to name their new church Siloama Church because they wanted it to be a place of healing. And they also saw themselves as being sent there for a reason. Now, I also learned that many of the people who went to Kalaupapa, they were courageous, they were very ethical. Many of them provided so much hope for the rest of the community. I didn't know this until this year, but that church kept records, the church minutes, from 1866 to 1928, and put them in a vault below the church. Imagine all those years, somebody talked about the ministry of the church. They wrote it down and they talked about the people who joined the church and the people who died. They kept meticulous records. And in 1928, it all ended up in a vault underneath the church. And the people probably just forgot about it because they thought, it's just a bunch of words. It's the story of our lives, but probably nobody cares that much about it. The other thing that occurred to me is during those days, almost every 10 years or so, there could be an entire turnaround of the population because people with leprosy didn't live that long. Some people died within months after arriving. It was rare to live 10 or 15 years once you had that stage of leprosy and you were sent to Kalaupapa. So these records were in the church. And it wasn't until 1938 that somebody was down there underneath the church and they found the vault and they pulled out all of these minutes which told the stories of all the people since 1866. So the first boatload arrived in January of 1866. That church was established in June of 1866. And those minutes told the stories from that point on for about 60 years of what it was like being the church, talking about Jesus' love, talking about God's presence in the midst of despair. I was so appreciative of hearing about these stories and these records, these minutes of the church. And I thought for a moment, we better make sure what we put down in our minutes are pretty accurate because maybe in 10 or 60 years, somebody's going to look back and say, what were those crazy people thinking back in Koloa back in 2017 and 2018? But anyway, one of the reasons I was especially grateful to read about the people of Kalaupapa during that time is because I first heard about Kalaupapa when I went to a Catholic school in California in 5th and 6th grade. The teacher told us all about Father Damien, told us all about the Catholic Church. And from what I remember, I was told that before Father Damien got there were all these Hawaiians that were just virtually savages. They didn't know how to read. They basically had no morals, and they treated each other horribly. And then Father Damien came along, and all of a sudden things got better, and things were wonderful after that because of Father Damien. And of course, he was a hero because he went to Kalaupapa and contracted leprosy himself, or Hansen's disease, and died there. I want to tell you that Father Damien has always been and continues to be one of my heroes in life. In fact, I shared a little bit about his life last week when I told you that I just finished the book Holy Man by Gavin Dawes, Father Damien of Molokai. And as I read this book, I was blown away by the compassion that this man had in ways that nobody else had ever had for the people of Kalaupapa before. He went there in 1873 because he chose to. The bishop in Honolulu, the Catholic bishop, knew that the people needed some help, and there were some Catholics there, and basically thinking, what are we going to do? Father Damien actually raised his hand and said, I'll be the first to go. And then Father Damien decided on his own, if it was okay with the bishop, that he would stay there. And he talked about we lepers. It wasn't me God's Messiah to you and all of you lepers. He talked about we lepers. He identified with the people. And one of the things that amazed me from this book is that he would sit down with them and eat poi out of the same calabash that the people with leprosy ate. And that's maybe how he got it. But he would touch them. He would put oil on their foreheads. He was their priest and their pastor, and eventually got leprosy himself. One of the things that I didn't know until I read this book was how famous Father Damien was during his lifetime. I had known since I was in 5th and 6th grade and went to Catholic school that he was famous after he died. But as I read this book, people all over America knew who Father Damien was, people all over Europe, and they sent money. And that's one of the reasons that he is known for being such a compassionate person. People knew about his sacrifice, and they sent thousands of dollars to Molokai. And actually, the bishop wasn't crazy about that because he wanted the money to go through Honolulu and then be sent to Molokai. And Father Damien just took the money, and he built homes, and he built hospitals, and he built schools, and he just did everything he could for the people. It was an amazing story to read, and I highly encourage you to read Holy Man if you haven't read it yet. But one of the things that occurred to me last June when I was at Ahapai Aina, and some of the reading I've done since then, and especially this past week, was I learned this really important lesson. And this is it. It's so important for all of us to tell our stories. For we all have important stories, no matter who we are. You don't have to be Father Damien or a famous person or a successful fundraiser or a pastor or a priest. As I was reading about the things that people found in that vault below the church, I thought, that little boy who went with a family member to take care of that person because it was unthinkable to send a family member to this place and not know if that person was taken care of. That little boy went to take care of somebody, and over the years there were hundreds, at least, maybe thousands of kokua that actually went to take care of people from their family. And thinking about all that they gave up, thinking about the fact that they could have gotten leprosy themselves, and many did, as I read the stories, I thought, what remarkable stories that these quiet, compassionate, silent sometimes people had. Those who aren't the people up front, and they're not the people that get a lot of attention. Their stories moved me so much. And as I was reading about these stories, I thought, we all have important stories, no matter who we are. And those stories just have to be told. In today's gospel lesson, Jesus healed, we are told, a leper. And that leper couldn't wait to tell his story. Now, Jesus said, don't go and tell anybody about what just happened. But can you imagine what it was like for that man who had leprosy? Let me just tell you that back in those days, in Jesus' time, in that place, having leprosy was no easier than it was in the 1860s and beyond on Molokai. It was probably even worse, because at least on Molokai, in Kalapapa, the people had a church to go to, and they had a community of faith, and they had hope in God and hope in an afterlife and hope that God was still doing something meaningful with their life, and they had that community. In Jesus' day, if you were a leper, you weren't even allowed to go near the synagogue, much less family members or anybody else for that matter. You had to cover your face. I think there was some kind of cloth they had to cover their face with so people wouldn't see the awful disfigurement that leprosy gave to them. And they had to basically walk around with a covered face yelling as loud as they could, leper, leper, if they ever saw anybody, just so everyone would know to keep their distance. Imagine being one of those people, knowing you could never go to church, never visit your family home, never even approach, much less hug or touch a family member again for the rest of your life. And you hear about this Jewish rabbi that seems to be healing people, and all he says to you is, I do choose. Be made clean, and your leprosy is gone. Would you keep your mouth shut? I know I wouldn't. And I actually think that Jesus was probably expecting this man to walk around saying, oh my gosh, you won't believe what just happened to me. I had leprosy. No one in the history of leprosy has ever been cured from it. And this man, Jesus, all he said was, be made clean. And I don't have leprosy anymore. I can't imagine anybody not talking about that. And as I was thinking of the story in the gospel and also thinking of the many stories from Kalaupapa, I thought, you know what? We all have stories to tell. We all have stories about faith, about God, about family, about community. And you might think that your story is not important. But I want to tell you, your story is important. Many of you know about the book that I wrote and was published the year that I arrived here, and it tells the story of my family's history in Kalapana, where Father Damien was before he went to Kalaupapa on Molokai. And as I researched my family's story, I'm sure that they thought that the simple things in their life just didn't matter to anybody. But I'll tell you, when I discovered things about my grandparents, who I never knew, and my great-grandparents, and my great-great-grandparents, and my great-great-great-grandparents, all the way back to my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who was born in 1756, it gave me so much joy and pleasure just knowing that I was a part of that. And somehow what they did back then influenced me. And sometimes I would read stories of courage and stories of hope and stories of amazing aloha. And I thought, I'm a part of that. I want you to know that each and every one of you here today is a part of a story that goes back centuries. And one of the things that just kept coming to me this week is how important names are in Hawaiian culture. When the kupuna, or the grandparents, would gather the keiki, or the children, together and tell them the stories of what it was like when they were little kids and what their parents were like and their grandparents, they always started with the name. They never said, oh, and you had a great-great-grandmother somewhere back there, and this is what her life was about. They always would say things like your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Kahekili Kahuiva, was born in this village, and this is what his life was like, and this is what he's known for. And they would go back so far. They always started with the names. And in Hawaiian culture, names have always been so important to attach to the stories, because it was the name and the story that provided the continuation of the lineage of each and every person. I was shocked to find out that of the 8,000 plus people who had leprosy, Hansen's disease, and were buried somewhere on that peninsula of Kalaupapa, less than 1,000 have named tombs. And the Hawaiian people who were related to them and knew them from their villages and their towns said to themselves several years ago, we need to do something about this because we have the names. The one thing that the churches and the government did back then is they kept accurate records. We have the names of every single person that went to Kalaupapa and died there. And so a few years ago, a group got together and said, how about if we put together a memorial and we list every single one of those 8,000 plus names so that when we go there as family members, as descendants, as people who are from their villages, we can look at their names and we can remember. So, at the Ahapai Aina last year in June, it was announced that we, as the United Church of Christ in Hawaii, had already given a significant amount of money to the Names Memorial as a church to say that our church people were there back in 1866, and we must honor them. And all the people that went there afterwards, we must honor them as well. And this is definitely an ecumenical effort. The Catholic Church and the United Church of Christ and many, many other people are working on this together right now, saying, let's raise money so that we can list the names of every single person that was there at Kalaupapa. I went there about 25 years ago, and I saw the graveyards. I saw both churches, the Silawama Church as well as the Catholic Church, St. Philomena. There's nothing more spiritual than I can think of in terms of a pilgrimage that I've participated in my life anyway, than going to Kalaupapa and seeing those graves, seeing Father Damien's grave, seeing the church that he built, and actually having a man who actually, I'm not sure if he's even alive anymore, gave us a tour, and he had leprosy or Hansen's disease. And he said, notice the floorboards as you walk in where the pews are. There's a space between them. And I didn't notice, but I thought, well, maybe the floorboards fell out, or maybe, they just didn't have enough wood. He said, when they first put the floor in, the floorboards are all touching, and people wouldn't walk into the church. When you have leprosy, you have to spit all the time. And they weren't going to spit on God's floor. So they went in and they removed places of the floorboards all along the pews so that when the people wanted to worship God and be together as a community of faith, they could spit, because they had to spit. And they would spit between the floorboards. It was amazing being there, and I plan to go back when the memorial is built. I want to look at those names, and I want to remember the stories. We obviously don't have time today to mention or name all 8,000 of those names, I don't think. However, I thought it would be really good just to mention the names of those 35 people who started the church at Silawama, but I couldn't find all 35. I know they're out there. So instead, what I'm going to do is read the names of the 12 people who first landed in January of 1866. And I'm going to pause after reading each name, and I would just like for you to think and remember as you hear these names. They're all Hawaiian. Let us remember these 8 men, 3 women, and 1 small boy. As I say each name, I invite you to honor them in your hearts. Loe, Kahauliko, Li'i, Puha, Kini, Lono, Waipio, Kainana, Ka'aumoana, Nahu'ina, Lakapu, Kepihe, may all of the people of Kalaupapa be honored. May we honor their names and their stories, and may we honor all of our stories that we carry with us today. Amen.